Echo. All right. Hey, everybody. This talk is cognitive biases and metacognition and the role that they can play in performing open source intelligence analysis. A little bit about myself. My name is Benjamin Brown. I work for Akamai Technologies. I work in the security architecture group, doing things like adversarial resilience, analysis and testing, system safety analysis, environmental hazards analysis, and thank God not nearly as much compliance as I used to have to do. All right, so to set the groundwork and context for what we're talking about, the realm that we're going to be in is cognitive biases, intelligence analysis, more specifically open source intelligence analysis, metacognition, critical thinking, and then I'm going to introduce some frameworks for structured analysis of intelligence. All right, so I can give you the what, but I also want to give you the why. So the actionable intelligence that we use to guide our decisions is a result of accurate conclusions and that are properly framed. Now, where these can go awry are where cognitive biases, also known as faulty heuristics or intelligence hazards, where they can lead to inaccurate conclusions, which would then feed into decisions that probably would not be the wisest. And to buffer against that, we're going to look at metacognition and critical thinking. And what this will allow us to do is arrive at more accurate solutions more often. So give you sort of an overhead view of the flow here. So bad data and biased analysis feeds into false conclusions. These false conclusions are what lead to bad intelligence and poor decisions. And this, of course, leads to apocalypse and Armageddon. So yes, that seems hyperbolic, but if you're familiar with the Bay of Pigs incident and the Cuban Missile Crisis, that is how that went down. Great, now onto open source intelligence. So the Army released an Army Techniques publication that talks about different intelligence terms and really lays out how they want to define them. For open source intelligence, they define it as intelligence that's produced from publicly available information. Now, publicly available information a lot of times doesn't have the best quality about it. It's almost like the Inquirer or something like that, a flood of really, really bad data. And so when we have all of this data, we don't want to call it intelligence as it is, because all it is at this point is information or data. Once it's properly analyzed, then it can become intelligence. And it's intelligence when it's timely, relevant, and actionable. You can do something with it at that point in time. So some of the uses for open source intelligence, if you have a new company that you're going to be merging with, if you have someone that you're looking at possibly hiring, or someone that you're possibly going to work for or with, it's really good to do some open source intelligence analysis on that person, their background, maybe some things that would raise a red flag for you. This also is useful in understanding threat actors, groups like Anonymous, and other possible threats to yourself or your company use open source communication methods that you could also see. So some of these sources include, of course, major search engines, social networks, communication services like IRC, e-commerce site profiles, think something like the Amazon purchasing history and commenting history. Business and tax records are really good for doing open source intelligence analysis of companies and entities, business entities. Also, media is another open source intelligence source. All right, so now I'm going to lay the groundwork for understanding cognitive biases. In this framework, what I'm talking about is not necessarily emotional or cultural, spiritual belief sort of biases. Those things are out of scope. Here I'm speaking more specifically to the base human brain functioning. So every day we're like drowned in data that our senses are taking in. And due to all of that data, our brain can't process things as they exist in reality outside of ourselves. So what our brain does to make this easier is it institutes patterns of subjective judgment or simplified processing strategies. And these are really useful for being able to deal with lots of information quickly, but it does lead to some hazards. So I'll give you an example. In this image here, it's a cylinder on a checkerboard pattern plane. And if you look at the tile that is marked A and the tile that is marked B, A seems to be darker than tile B. So what our brain is doing when looking at this image is it's not seeing the colors as they are. It's deducing what the colors should be, or it thinks based on past experience and a number of other factors what the difference is between those two. Now, in the next slide, I'll break the illusion here. So A and B are actually the exact same color. If I were to take the color picker tool or take this image into Photoshop, then you could see that A and B are the same color value. But when we're looking at this image, they seem to be different colors or different shades. So I'll give specific types of cognitive biases that are related to talking about open source intelligence. There are lots and lots of biases that we've identified and categorized and explained, but I'm going to specifically drill down to a few for open source intelligence. This one a lot of people are most likely familiar with, the confirmation bias. This is where you have an idea about how something should be or how your analysis is going to go, and having that sort of predetermined idea or hypothesis, it starts to become a self-fulfilling prophecy, in that when you're looking for evidence that really supports that initial hypothesis instead of being open to contradictory or competing hypotheses. Now, the self-serving bias makes a lot of sense. We are social creatures. We live in a socially hierarchical society. So it's ingrained in us to really have a sense of social or career advancement, self-preservation, really deal with self-esteem in the view of the other social creatures that we engage with. So this is the bias that triggers actions based on things like self-enhancement, self-preservation, how you look in society. This bias, the echo effect, this is one that you can often see in the media, and where a story becomes part of something like a game of media telephone, where there's a source that a media outlet picks up some information from, writes a piece on. Another media outlet takes that and then writes a piece on it, changing it slightly. And then it goes on and on and on until, later on, you can't really tell, A, what the original source was, and B, the accuracy of how it's being reported or portrayed. These sorts of things feed directly into the bandwagon effect, and also they promote groupthink. When you see this story or way of framing data repeated over and over again, you're prone to think that it must be accurate or true. The representativeness bias is indicative of this draw to really focus on similarities between pieces of data instead of actually looking at the differences. One subcategory here is the base rate neglect fallacy. So really helpful tool for dealing with base rate neglect is using the Bayesian theorem. So remember, Bayes is your bro. When you're dealing with statistical data, you want to be very clear about what the base rate is that's being talked about. I'll give you an example. So say there's a deadly disease X. It only afflicts 0.01% of the population. There's a cheap diagnostic test that can find the disease in 99.5% of those who have it. And there's only a false positive rate of 1.95%. So it's a cheap test, seems highly accurate. You know, you go to the doctor, you say, hey, I want to take this test, you know, to make sure that I don't have this disease. You take the test and it comes back positive. Initial thought, oh my God, I'm dying. I have to have this disease, right? Because, I mean, it's 99.5% accurate, and the false positive rate is only 1.95%. So let's dig in a little more. So you have to remember that it's 99.5% likely to find it if you have it. It's a diagnostic test. Now, if we take a population of 1 million people, have them all tested, and 100 of them would show up as infected, given our percentages, and the test would accurately identify, the test would accurately identify 99 of them as infected. But 19,500 uninfected people will receive false positives on the test. I mean, that's a pretty large number of false positives. So it's very important to really, when someone's giving you data about a statistic and it seems like, you know, scary or can cause some FUD, really look at what the base rate and how it's being used. This one is rather insidious. This is availability bias. And this is looking at things like anecdata, which is anecdotal data, and the human mind, when hearing information from a first-hand account or a second-hand account, lends a lot of weight, just because how we operate as social creatures, you know, we lend that sort of data a lot of weight. More weight than we typically would of information that we've just read and have no connection to the author or the teller of that data. Also, the virility, or how much a topic can trend. Again, it ties in to something very akin to the echo effect, and that we see this information in the way it's portrayed over and over and over again. Censorship. Censorship definitely plays a role in the availability of data. And you need to be accounting for the data that is not there, as well as the data that's there when you're doing your research. So also looking at the language of the person doing the analysis, the native tongue that they speak, and the other languages that they're able to speak, as well as their proficiency levels. So when you're doing research and you only speak English, you're missing out on tons of data in other languages that you don't have access to. And that data could be very, very important data for your analysis. There's also this concept of maskirovka, which the Soviets deployed very, very deftly in the Cold War. And the way that they did their disinformation campaigns was rather ingenious in that they would flood the intelligence communications channels with lots of false data, but they would also seed true data within that false data. Now this is important because if they were just sending out false data, then you could, like we were talking about before, look at the gaps in the data. What's missing? And that would be a good indicator of, what's actually going on or what is true. But when you're getting all the information out there, all it is noise, because you have no way to discern between the true data and the false data. This is something that you see in effect now with the hijacking or subversion of anonymous campaigns. There are state-backed entities that will use anonymous campaigns or even start their own and false flag operations, and they'll definitely engage in this disinformation. So for people that work for vendors that put out reports where they've done intelligence analysis and they're doing threat analysis reports, this is what I'm going to be talking about in the second slide, or the second set of slides here. So I want to ground all of this theory that we've been talking about in real situations. So the first one I'll talk about is Reddit and the Boston bombers. So when the Boston bombings occurred and the police and the FBI and other agencies were out looking for who committed this crime, the internet community at Reddit wanted to play detective. They got together and started doing analysis of lots of different things. So some of the things that they looked at is public photos and videos that were uploaded to social sites, and looking at things like who's not paying enough attention to the race, who's wearing a certain kind of hat or sneakers or a particular backpack, who looks like they're in a place or coming from a place that they normally wouldn't. These are all sort of sketchy ways of looking at this data, as most of it is not high quality. Also looking at police scanner snippets and taking them out of context. And in the course of doing this detective work, they named multiple suspects. And so it turns out that one of the main suspects that they've pinned as the person who committed this crime, Sunil, was a college student who had disappeared, and nobody had heard from him for a while. So, they posted all of his data, all of his family's data, doxed him essentially, and media outlets picked up, this person as, being the possible bomber. Turns out the kid had drowned, and his family was dealing with not only the death of their family member, but also having to deal with all of this internet harassment and media harassment as well. So some of the biases that were at effect. The bandwagon effect was definitely there. The echo effect, especially when the media got involved. Confirmation bias, and this was really nasty, and that the confirmation bias inherent here is a lot of, I would say something like 95-99% of the people that were being named as possible suspects were male and brown. And so there was self-serving bias also at effect here, because there's karma, there are internet points to be had. The next area that I'm going to talk about is all of the reports on APT, the Advanced Persistent Threat. And typically, when people say or hear APT, one of the main undercurrents there is, oh my God, China. So out of these reports, some of the evidence and the methodologies that were used included things like the type of remote administration tool. Now, these tools that they named are publicly available to anyone. Geolocation of the command and control centers using MaxMind. If you've ever done geolocation of IPs through that, you know it is really, really inaccurate. Shared similarities with past APTs. Again, that's digging into the representativeness, looking at what is similar instead of also weighing that against major differences. And the authors, the people who actually wrote the scripts that the attackers used. Now, these are freely available scripts that anyone can go and download, and these attackers use them, and part of the evidence that was listed in these reports was that the native language of the tool author was Chinese. Not the person who used the tool, the person who originally wrote the tool. Doesn't make any sense to me. Also looking at the general tone and lack of methodology, I would say that the messaging there was, we're expert researchers, just trust us, you don't need to know how we did it. And my response to that is, show me your methodology. So some of the biases that affect. The people who are putting out these reports, the vast majority of them are vendors in the same space that they're putting the reports out to. So it really behooves them to really sort of message their reports in a certain way that is supporting their products. And so there's also confirmation bias involved in these reports. Definitely a self-serving bias in that they'll sell you the solution. And the availability bias in terms of what data they were able to have access to and capture. Another area that there are a lot of cognitive biases that have real-world impacts are the doxing of people. And is anybody here not familiar with doxing? Okay, great. So some examples. After Amanda Todd took her life, supposedly after being bullied online, these internet white knights wanted to find her bully and out them and dox them. So they doxed someone, and it turns out it was not the bully. This person ended up losing their job, having to move, change all of their, their contact information, and I believe also looking at changing their name, just because of all of the death threats and hate mail and drive-bys and things like that they were dealing with, based on a false dox. During the anonymous Scientology war, there was a 59-year-old couple that was doxed as being these pro-Scientology hackers. These people use a computer to maybe write email. That's about it. After the Adam Lanza events, there was a parody account started up, and somebody who thought it was very unfortunate that this parody account existed wanted to dox the owner. Well, they ended up doxing a 71-year-old woman in Missouri. Something in the same vein was Newsweek's outing of who they deemed the creator of Bitcoin. Turns out the guy wasn't. So, now he is in court suing Newsweek. DDoS statistics. A lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and then, of course, the sales pitch right after. I really encourage you, when you read these DDoS statistics reports, go back and look for the base rate, look for how long they've actually been capturing this data, and where they haven't been capturing this data. Another area of osint fail was the search for the Malaysia Airways flight. And this was, again, another one where the media really caused the echo effect here. There was a group that was online doing a search for trying to find the downed plane. And their main tool, and this was a large movement. A lot of people were getting into it. Their main tool for searching for the plane was Google Maps, because that's in real time. All right, so yes, that's sad. It has real-world impact, and it hurts companies' credibilities. What do we do about it? So what's going to be useful here is metacognition, or thinking about thinking. So 3 questions to ask yourself as you're collecting data, doing intelligence analysis, and even after you've selected your hypothesis, is you want to ask yourself, what do I think I know? How do I think I know it? And when would that not be true? So as knowing is half the battle, knowing about cognitive biases are helpful for us in that it's difficult to affect those things that we don't know we don't know. So cognitive biases, unless you are incredibly neurologically atypical, cognitive biases will be at effect for you. And to go one level deeper, a little more meta, be careful of the bias. Now, this is the belief that your personal biases are actually insight and not bias. So there's been a lot of work done in this area by Dr. Emily Pronin at the Princeton University Department of Psychology. And throughout her tests, she's finding that subjects report being less susceptible to bias themselves and inferring heightened bias in others, especially when they hold opinions that are contrary. So here you want to be actively seeking out peer review, diverse outside expertise, especially from non-security sectors and individuals, and alternative mindsets. Remember, we're talking about open source intelligence here, so it's not like you have to hide this data. So there are 2 frameworks that have been developed for intelligence analysis by the military and by other government sectors that have been effective in their tests to really hedge the impact of cognitive biases during analysis. The first framework Richard Hoyer was a psychologist for the CIA, and he wanted to change the way that the CIA did intelligence analysis to help them more accurately provide actionable intelligence. So he came up with a checklist for analysts, and this involves defining the problem, generating your hypotheses, collecting the information, evaluating your hypotheses, selecting the most likely of them, and then continuing to do ongoing monitoring of new information. So in the defining the problem phase, this is where you're making sure that you're asking the right question. Your framing is correct. The context for why you're asking what you're asking is clear. You know who your audience is, the final consumer of this intelligence. And you have specificity around what you're doing and why. When you're generating your hypotheses, at this point you're identifying all of the plausible hypotheses. What you're doing here is you're not screening out or rejecting any of them. You want anything that's probable, you want to be writing down. You also want to consider actor deception, like we discussed earlier with Maskirovka. In your collection of information, you want to be wary of the confirmation bias. You don't want to just focus on the data that backs up likely hypotheses. You want to suspend judgment at this point, and you want to really make note of where there are gaps in the info, where you think you should be able to get data around something and you can't. In the evaluating hypotheses stage, this is a neat distinction, and this works to directly counteract representativeness bias. And you're developing arguments against each hypothesis, not arguments for each hypothesis. You're checking your assumptions. You're not going to have perfect data, so you're going to have to be dealing with assumptions that you're working with. And you want to check their origins. Why are you assuming these things? Also, implementing an analysis of competing hypotheses framework. There are a lot of tools out there that you can use for ACH analysis. This is a simple one, is where you have your hypotheses listed here, and across the top you'll have your different pieces of information or data, and really looking at the correlation. Now, when you're selecting your most likely hypotheses, you're looking for the least evidence against each hypothesis. You're not looking for the most evidence for. Here you're rejecting hypotheses, you're not confirming them. You also want to note and keep track of alternate hypotheses. This is really useful for the later stage. This is the ongoing monitoring stage. So you're adding new data sources, you're plugging into these new pieces of data into your alternate hypotheses, and you're keeping your conclusions tentative. Now the second structure. This one was developed by the US government specifically for military intelligence analysis. This one's newer. Richard's framework was developed in the early 70s, late 60s. This one, the latest publication is 2009. So the three main areas here are diagnostic techniques for analysis, contrarian techniques for analysis, and imaginative thinking techniques. In the diagnostic techniques, you're going to be doing your key assumptions check, and this is something you want to do throughout your analysis. This is the what do we think we know, why do we think we know it. You're going to be looking at the quality of the information that you're using. Again, this is very important for open source intelligence analysis. You're looking at indicators or signposts that something's changed. Also, you're going to be doing an analysis of competing hypotheses, again, like we discussed earlier. The contrarian techniques are very useful in that a lot of times they're not nearly as resource intensive as the other techniques. These include things like devil's advocacy, doing a team A, team B analysis. Team A, team B analysis is where you give two separate teams all of the data and information to do their analysis, and then you put them into rooms where they cannot communicate with each other. And they're going to do their analysis, and then they're going to come back, and you're going to look at how their analyses are different. Why are they different? Also, you want to look at high impact, low probability events. This is black swan events. Also doing a what if analysis, which is really useful for that third question of, I think I know something, but when would what I think I know not be true? What if this changed in the environment? What if this was actually going on? Now, imaginative thinking techniques, sometimes, especially the ones other than brainstorming, take more resources, and they're very useful for the strategy level of the analysis. So brainstorming is definitely in this group, but with brainstorming you want to be very conscious and cognizant of making sure that you're not just speaking into an echo chamber. That each time you're using this event, it's the same minds coming up with the same ways of thinking and analyzing over and over again. Outside-in thinking, red team analysis, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. Also doing an alternative futures analysis. This one is rather time-consuming, but is very useful for the strategy level. What you're doing here is you're looking at where you are now, and you're saying, okay, if this thing changed in the world, how would that branch out to other possibilities? And then from those branches, if this thing changed, how would that branch out further? And really making a tree, a large map of possible futures. And what that's useful for is when you have a piece of data or you get information that gives you an indicator that things are moving along one of your branches, it gives you foresight into what could be coming after that. So included in this publication is also a timeline for when each of these techniques will be the most impactful on your analysis. So brainstorming throughout, key assumptions checks you want to do throughout, your what if and black swan analysis you want to do early on in the process, your red team analysis, again, early on, devil's advocacy you want to hold off until towards the end, when you have enough information to effectively be the devil's advocate. All right, so how do we apply these things? Well, look at what makes sense. What are your goals in doing this analysis? Are you clear about your goals? Who are the customers? Who's going to be consuming this? And what is the scope? You know, you're not just going to try and find out everything about everything. You want to be very clear about the boundaries of your analysis. You want to be cognizant of what your technique costs are, and in terms of your time, your personnel, and budget. And when you're finalizing or even making a preliminary report, you want to be clearly defining your goals, your sources where applicable, the audience, be clear about who is supposed to be consuming this, the limitations. Again, you're not going to have perfect data, so there are going to be limitations either in resources, in access to information, maybe because of linguistic barriers, things like that. You also want to be listing what your working assumptions are. You know, really lay that clearly out at the beginning of your report. And the most important one is methodology. This is what really lends credibility to an analysis, is when you have your methodology clearly laid out for anyone to go in and test it. Now, out of this conversation, there are some areas for further research. Chrononarcissism. This is the concept that what is happening now, because it is happening now while you are alive, it is more important than what has happened in the past. And so that sort of data, that more current data, sometimes gets heavier weight than historical data. Also looking at sociocultural and economic contexts. So data isn't pure, right? It doesn't just exist in sort of this quantum bubble, you know, in a vacuum. It's created and impacted by cultural, social, and economic events that are going on around it. Also looking at unknown unknowns and blind spots. You know, there are the things that you know, and you know them. And there are things that you maybe don't know how to do something. That would be something that you know you don't know. But this area of the unknown unknown, the things that you don't know, you can't act on them because you don't know that they're there or missing. Looking at who is the originator of data and getting really meta, and that not only is the analyzer of the data going to have their biases at effect, but the person who created that data in the first place also had biases at effect. So looking at how the data came out, what the frame is for it, what the context is for it, and what's missing from it. And all of that could have been impacted by the originator's biases. Also looking at data supply chain pressures. Oftentimes, you don't get data directly from the initial source. It goes through a process. And then those processes are going to shape that data in some way. There are a lot of tools out there for doing intelligence analysis, specifically open source intelligence analysis, tools for gathering information, harvesting them, and there are tools for mapping them out. And really, I would be interested in seeing in-depth analysis of these tools and their baked-in biases. These tools were made by people that have biases. And the tools are going to operate in a particular way and not operate in other particular ways that could bias the data. And there is more that can be done in terms of analysis of competing hypotheses and their place in information security. Information security and specifically security intelligence analysis it's a very, very new field. This is not something that we've been doing for a long time. So we can look to other areas that have been doing things like analysis of competing hypotheses and working with data to come up with hypotheses and theories, and we can see what are the pitfalls that they've dealt with, how have they dealt with them, and bring that into our field. So, some pieces of reading. So Hoyer's seminal work was The Psychology of Intelligence Analysis, and it's available from the government press. And they also have the Tradecraft Primer available. I was able to get both of these from Amazon, actually. And another one that was really cool that I liked was Judgment and Managerial Decision Making. And what Max does in this book is he walks you through different sort of workshops, different little activities that you can do that show your biases to you, like right in front of your face, actively happening as you're doing these exercises. It's really neat. So essentially, what I am attempting to do here is start this conversation right in our industry. We are a new industry, especially where intelligence analysis is concerned, and I want us to improve. You know, I want us to be really having actionable intelligence out there that is useful, that makes a positive impact in the world. And we have to start looking at how we're doing this analysis and why. Again, the three really important questions to be asking yourself when, even if you're not doing specifically intelligence analysis, it's just useful to really use this metacognitive tool of what do I think I know? Why do I think I know it? And when would it not be true? Just constantly asking yourself those questions. Right, so I am ready to take questions if anybody has any. I also realize that this is not a typical computer science sort of space, and that if you have not come from soft sciences, it can be a lot to ingest. Yes? Well, certainly. Yes. Like I said, it's always going to be active, right? So it's looking for, you know, what's not there, what's missing, like you pointed out, and also you know, what there is to put in. And if I were to do this as an actual paper, a white paper, I would certainly include that in my scope and assumptions at the forefront. So a lot of them are, and that you don't recognize. It's not in the forefront of your brain that it's going on. And but there are certainly ways to be divisive about it, right? To really use biases as tools. Marketing people do it all the time. Mhm. Hmm. Unless you're a hermit in a cave that's not dealing, or you know, a Zen master on a mountaintop, uh, that bias is going to be at effect because you're having to operate in a social hierarchical structure. So I would say that that is the distinction, and that yes, somebody could be actively knowing that they're doing those sorts of activities, and that would just make them an asshole, right? Yes. Yeah. So before I did the job that I do now, I worked in general IT, I guess. I was doing accounts creation and management and things like that, and I would often use open source intelligence there to look at things like when I had Google Alerts set up to see, when we had certain domains that would pop up on a Google search, and to make sure that it wasn't like a dump of credentials, or it wasn't, an in-map scan of our systems, or a harvester script being run. And you can use open source intelligence for a lot of these things. Anywhere where um, data integrity, assurance, or confidentiality is really important, which I would say is a lot of areas. Yes. Oh, so some of the ones that I really like, the harvester is useful. Maltego is really interesting for actually, what Maltego does is you get data and you can run transforms on it, and it'll actually map it out for you. So you can see hotspots of social connections. You can see connections between entities or accounts. And sometimes to just get your brain, instead of just looking at the actual data in terms of characters, looking at it as a picture or a map can be useful in really giving you that aha. Um, Really, if you're dealing with worries about things like DDoS attacks or um, credential dumping, of course, all the paste sites are really useful, like Pastebin. Also, there's LeakedIn. LeakedIn is a blog that constantly searches a lot of these paste sites for, interesting information, like hard-coded passwords, credential dumps, credit card dumps, things like that, um, which is useful if you have customers that you're attempting to protect from these sorts of things, or deal with as an incident manager. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's one, it is a Python script. It's called cree.py, creepy. That one is good for Facebook analysis, and it's automated. And it leverages things like the Facebook search features, the API, the friends of friends, and some of the other uh, horrible privacy overlooks. Um, and let's see, other good ones. There really is there are a lot of tools that are very specific in what they target, but I would love to see somebody develop sort of a meta tool, one that's a good dashboard that lets you just kick off a whole bunch of different ones. Uh, and Maltego is starting to do that with their added transforms. But again, a lot of the tools, it really depends on what specifically you're looking for and what sources you want to use. And again, that's something to be cognizant of, is when you're using these tools, also think about what areas are these tools not targeting? What's the data that you're missing? Um, and I can when I put up the list of slides, I'll also add a slide that has a whole bunch of tools on it. Tapir, T-A-P-I-R, is another one that's really useful for automated collection. I'm sorry, could you say that again? Oh yeah, ReconNG is great. I like it. It's not very accessible, I think, to someone who is not used to using scripts in that format. But I mean, I find it's really powerful and useful. Again, you definitely want to be cognizant of what's ReconNG not collecting, and what is the way in which it's displaying or framing the information for you, and what are different ways that it could be displayed that could make a difference in the way you analyze it. All right, great. Thank you guys very much.